Forget the heroes you grew up with. Forget the stories of valor and honor. Today, we're stepping into a world where mythology is stained with blood, and fear is the only currency that matters. You think you know the gods and goddesses? You think you know what it takes to be a warrior? Prepare to have your entire worldview shattered. Our journey begins not with a valiant champion, but with a god, a figure whose very name echoes with the clang of steel, the screams of the defeated, and the primal unthinking rage of battle. The ancient Greeks had many gods of war, but only one struck a true guttural terror into their hearts. This wasn't the strategic, honorable goddess Athena, who led armies to victory with clever tactics. No, this was the god of pure, unadulterated slaughter. A god whose presence on the battlefield was a harbinger of a hell on earth, where civility and reason were torn to shreds. I'm talking about Ares. Now, if your mind's eye is conjuring up some handsome, sometimes bumbling figure from a modern movie or TV show, erase that image. That version is a pale, neutered reflection of the truth. The original Ares was a nightmare made flesh. The ancient Greeks didn't worship him out of reverence. They offered him sacrifices out of abject fear. They did so to appease the brutal, unpredictable side of war that he represented. He was an embodiment of the savage, brutal side of combat itself. He was the thunderous, unthinking chaos that descends upon men when they abandon all sense of self. Imagine a storm of violence, a vortex of rage that leaves nothing but a trail of bodies, and a landscape of ruin. That was Ares. He wasn't a strategic general. He was a berserker on a divine scale. He wasn't celebrated for his victories, but reviled for his cruelty. The ancient poets and playwrights almost always depicted him as a loathsome figure, a god so consumed by bloodlust that he was often seen as the very definition of barbarism. Even his fellow gods on Mount Olympus, including his own father Zeus, looked upon him with a mixture of disdain and terror. He was the one god they wanted to keep as far away from human affairs as possible, because his involvement meant one thing: nobody was coming home alive. But his terror was more than just a reputation. It was psychological. Ares didn't just kill. He instilled a kind of panic that broke armies before a single sword was drawn. His very presence could turn the most disciplined phalanx into a screaming mob, fighting against each other in a desperate bid for survival. The tales describe him as a towering figure, his armor gleaming with the blood of fallen warriors, his bellowing war cry enough to shake the foundations of the world. He rode into battle in a chariot drawn by 4 fire-breathing horses: Phobos, Deimos, Aether, and Enyo, names that mean fear, terror, atmosphere, and horror. This wasn't a hero's entrance. It was an apocalypse. Let's dive deeper into a specific myth to truly grasp the scale of his terror. In the epic poem The Iliad, Ares is a major force on the battlefield of the Trojan War. He doesn't pick a side out of a sense of justice or honor, but simply because he loves the carnage. At one point, he's wounded by the mortal hero Diomedes, with the help of Athena. The scream Ares lets out is so immense, so utterly deafening, that it is said to have sounded like the cries of 10,000 warriors combined. This wasn't a scream of pain as we know it, but a sound of cosmic primordial fury. The sheer power of it was enough to make the other gods on Olympus tremble. This wasn't a warrior, it was a force of nature, a raw, destructive energy barely contained in a divine form. So why is he at number 10 on our list? Because Ares is the origin of terror in mythology. He is the standard by which all other ferocious warriors are measured. His legend isn't built on noble deeds or grand quests, but on the primal, universal fear of senseless violence. He is the embodiment of the darkness that lurks in the heart of every conflict. He serves as a terrifying reminder that even among gods, there exists an insatiable hunger for destruction, and that sometimes, the most successful warrior isn't the one who wins, but the one who terrifies everyone into submission. He is the first, but certainly not the last, of our mythical nightmares. But if you think a god of war is terrifying, what about a warrior who isn't even flesh and blood, a creation of man's hubris that turned against its master? The story of our next warrior is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is one without a soul to lose. From the screaming chaos of the battlefield, we now descend into a different kind of terror, a cold, silent dread, born not of fury and bloodlust, but of man's hubris. We move from the divine warrior to a creation of mortal hands, a being with no soul, no fear, and no mercy. We are talking about the golem. This isn't just a monster, it's a fundamental question of what it means to be a warrior. What happens when you remove all human elements, all emotion, all strategy, all life? In Jewish folklore, the golem is a figure of immense power, often a protector, but its true terrifying nature lies in its blankness. its empty shell. It is an unstoppable force of nature, a clay automaton brought to life through mystical incantations and the sacred name of God. It's a warrior without a heart, a protector without a soul, and its single-minded purpose can, and often does, spiral into cataclysm. The most famous golem is said to have been created in the 16th century by Rabbi Judah Loa ben Bezalel of Prague. The story goes that he fashioned a figure from the clay of the Vltava River to protect the Jewish community from persecution and blood libels. To animate it, he placed a shem, a sacred parchment with the name of God, into its mouth. The golem, named Yosef, came to life, and for a time it was a miracle. It patrolled the ghetto, its immense strength and unthinking obedience striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. But here is where the terror truly begins. A golem doesn't have a mind of its own. It cannot differentiate between a threat and a misunderstanding. It has one purpose, and it will execute that purpose with a chilling, unwavering efficiency. As the golem grew in size and strength, its power became a double-edged sword. It could not be reasoned with. It could not be stopped with a plea or a gesture of surrender. Its strength was so immense that even a simple task could lead to massive destruction. One tale describes how the golem, tasked with fetching water, continued to fill the barrels until the entire city was on the verge of flooding. Its unthinking obedience was its most terrifying weapon. It was an unstoppable machine that saw no difference between a human life and a discarded piece of wood. The golem's horror is subtle but profound. It is the fear of being insignificant in the face of an unstoppable force, a force you yourself created, a force that has no malice, but is all the more dangerous for its lack of it. Imagine facing an enemy that doesn't hate you, doesn't want to conquer you, and doesn't even see you as a person. It just sees you as an obstacle to be removed. There is no glory in fighting a golem, no honor in defeating it. There is only the desperate, frantic terror of trying to stop something that cannot be stopped. The legend of Rabbi Lo and his golem came to a tragic end. The golem's power grew uncontrollable. Its rampage became so destructive that the very community it was created to protect was now in danger. In a desperate attempt to save his people, the rabbi confronted the golem in the attic of a synagogue. He was able to remove the shem from its mouth, causing the golem to crumble back into lifeless clay. Its immense, heavy form fell to pieces, filling the attic with dust and silence. But the legend of the golem's terrifying power persists. It is a cautionary tale, a warning against meddling with powers beyond our comprehension. It is a symbol of the terrifying consequences of unthinking power. A golem doesn't get tired. It doesn't feel pain. It doesn't fear death because it was never truly alive. A human warrior can be defeated by a clever trick, a moment of doubt, or a well-placed blow. But how do you defeat a being that feels nothing, thinks nothing, and exists only to perform its function? The golem's strength wasn't just physical. It was its terrifying inevitability. It was the crushing, hopeless feeling that no matter what you did, the machine would keep moving forward. The golem stands at number 9, not just for its strength, but for its philosophical terror. It represents the monstrousness of a soldier who is nothing more than a tool, a being that is devoid of will, but capable of unimaginable destruction. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest warriors aren't the ones filled with rage, but the ones filled with nothing at all. But if you think an unthinking clay figure is scary, what about a warrior who is also a god, but one who feasts on the very essence of human despair? From the cold, silent horror of a machine built to kill, we travel back in time. We enter a world of dust and clay tablets, where the earliest stories of humanity were etched into history. Our last warrior was a being without a soul. This one had a soul so immense, so powerful, and so tragically flawed that it consumed everything and everyone around him. His terror wasn't born of a battlefield or a mystical ritual. It was born from the throne of a great city, and it came from a power so vast, it was considered a punishment from the heavens themselves. At number 8, we have a figure whose very name is synonymous with the dawn of epic poetry, Gilgamesh. But put aside the image of the heroic king who seeks immortality. Before his grand journey, before his friendship with Enkidu, Gilgamesh was not a hero. He was a monster, a ruthless tyrant who used his godlike strength to terrorize the people he was meant to protect. The ancient Sumerians, the very people who wrote his story, didn't initially celebrate him. They feared him. They wept under his reign, and their cries of despair were so loud, so desperate, that they reached the ears of the gods. The terror of Gilgamesh was a unique and deeply personal one. He was not a distant, raging god like Ares. He was right there, in the streets of Uruk, his city. The myths describe him as a towering figure, with a body that was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. This made him stronger than any man, faster than any beast, and utterly immune to mortal rules. But his divine nature didn't make him merciful, it made him cruel. His power wasn't a gift for his people, it was a weapon he wielded against them. He was a warrior who saw his city as his personal playground, and his citizens as playthings. Imagine living in a city where the ruler's every whim is a law more terrifying than death itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh details his tyrannical behavior, including a practice that would chill the blood of any human, the rite of the first night, a savage custom where he claimed every bride for himself before her husband could. But his cruelty went beyond that. He forced his men into brutal, endless combat trials, not for the defense of the city, but for his own amusement. He was a force of nature in human form, a hurricane of power that ravaged his own home. He was the soul eater, not because he devoured flesh, but because he consumed the very essence of his people's happiness, their peace, their hope, and their dignity. His reign of terror was a slow, crushing weight that wore down the spirit of Uruk until it was but a shadow of its former self. The people of Uruk were utterly helpless. What could a mere mortal do against a king who was part god? His strength was limitless, his ambition insatiable, and his rage unpredictable. There was no escape, no recourse, no one to appeal to. He was the king, the judge, and the executioner, all rolled into one impossibly powerful being. His terror was so profound that it led the people to do the one thing they believed might save them. They prayed. They didn't pray for strength or a miracle. They prayed for deliverance. They begged the gods to create an equal, a rival, a warrior who could finally challenge the terrifying might of their king and bring an end to his reign. And so the gods answered. They created Enkidu, a wild man of the steppes, a being of equal strength and power, to be Gilgamesh's foil. Enkidu wasn't born to be a friend, he was born to be an opponent, a divine weapon sent to end the tyrant's monstrous behavior. The entire first part of the Epic of Gilgamesh is the story of this confrontation, the epic struggle between these two behemoths that eventually forces Gilgamesh to change. It's only after this struggle, after he is finally humbled by an equal, that Gilgamesh begins his transformation into the hero we remember. The hero's journey is only possible because he was first the villain, the soul eater, whose unchecked power was a threat to all of humanity. Gilgamesh earns his spot at number 8 because he is a chilling reminder that the greatest warriors, the ones with the most spectacular legends, often have a dark side so profound it can shake the very foundations of their world. His terror was not a foreign force attacking a city from the outside, but an internal rot, a poison that came from the top and seeped into every corner of his civilization. He was the god king who was so terrifying, his own people had to beg for a hero to be created just to save them from him. But what happens when the warrior's terror doesn't come from a god's cruelty, but from a monstrous rage that turns a man into something else? We face the terror of a divine force of rage and the cold, unfeeling horror of an automaton. Now we dive into a madness born not of godhood or magic, but of a warrior's deliberate choice to shatter his own mind. Imagine standing on a battlefield. Your enemy is a human, like you, but then you watch as he sheds his armor, howling like a wolf, his eyes rolling back in his head. He bites his shield, frothing at the mouth, and his strength becomes inhuman. He no longer feels pain. He no longer feels fear. He no longer even recognizes you as a person. At number 7, we have the berserker. The word berserker is often thrown around to describe any wild warrior, but in Norse mythology and history, it meant something much, much darker. This was a specific type of warrior who entered a trance-like state known as berserker gang, literally the going berserk. It was a state of battle frenzy so intense it completely consumed the man, leaving behind only a monstrous, unstoppable engine of destruction. The sagas tell of these warriors draped in bearskins, who could ignore the deepest wounds, and whose strength was said to be a gift from the god of war himself, Odin. But this wasn't a gift of honor, it was a curse of bloodlust. The true terror of the berserker was this transformation. They were not just fighting with ferocity, they were fighting with an utter lack of sanity. Imagine a warband charging at you, and among them is a man who seems to be a walking embodiment of chaos. He's not using tactics, he's not protecting himself. He's simply lashing out with a strength that defies all reason. The sagas describe them as so powerful that they could tear down trees and hurl massive boulders. But the most terrifying part, they were impervious to conventional weapons. Steel would simply slide off their skin or bend against their muscles as if they were made of iron. You could land a perfect strike, and they would not even flinch. They would simply keep coming, their eyes locked in a crazed stare, their mouths foaming with a primal rage. You weren't fighting a man, you were fighting a force of nature, a raging storm with a sword. The psychological impact of this was devastating. Facing a berserker was not a matter of skill or courage, it was a matter of sheer hopeless survival. How do you defeat something that doesn't feel pain? How do you reason with something that has no mind? It was said that the only way to kill a berserker was to either land a lucky blow in a vital, undefended area, or to simply outlast them. The berserker gang was a frenzy, and it could not last forever. Eventually, the immense rush of power would subside, leaving the warrior exhausted and helpless, often in a deep stupor for days. But in that moment, in the heat of battle, their terror was absolute. Their allies were often as afraid of them as their enemies were. A berserker in the frenzy could not tell friend from foe, and many a warrior had to make the choice between fighting the enemy or defending themselves from one of their own gone mad. But why did they do it? The sagas offer little explanation beyond a divine blessing. However, historians and scholars have offered fascinating and chilling theories. Some suggest the berserkergang was an act of psychological self-hypnosis, an intense, focused mindset that blocked out pain and fear. Others point to a more sinister cause, the use of psychoactive substances, specifically the fly agaric mushroom, a powerful hallucinogen. Imagine the effect: a warrior ingests this substance, and their mind is plunged into a chaotic, rage-fueled reality. They might not just be fighting men, they might be seeing demons, giants, or mythical beasts, and fighting with a terror and ferocity that is completely divorced from the reality of the battlefield. This makes the berserker not just a warrior, but a man willingly sacrificing his sanity for power, a terrifying bargain that transformed him from human to monster. The berserker earns his spot at number 7 because he represents a unique kind of terror. It is the terror of a warrior who chooses to become a weapon. Ares' rage was a constant of his divine nature. The golem's unfeeling force was simply its programming. But the berserker chose to break his own mind, to give up his humanity for a temporary, horrifying power. He is the ultimate example of a human being crossing a line from which there is no return, a line that separates a soldier from a beast. But if the berserker's rage was a choice, what about a warrior whose monstrous fury was a magical curse placed upon him, a rage he could not control? We have witnessed the chosen madness of the berserker, a warrior who willingly sacrifices his mind for power. But what happens when that madness is not a choice but a curse? When a hero's rage is so potent, so utterly consuming, that it physically twists him into a grotesque, horrifying monster? What if the most valiant champion of a kingdom was also its greatest hidden terror? At number 6, we leave the frostbitten lands of the Norse and journey to the Emerald Isle of ancient Ireland, where we find the legendary hero, Cuchulainn, and his horrifying Rheostrad, or warp spasm. Now, you likely know Cuchulainn as the Hound of Ulster, the fierce and handsome champion who defended his kingdom single-handedly. He's often depicted as a paragon of heroic virtue, a master of combat and a symbol of national pride. But buried deep within those heroic tales is a side of him so chilling, so otherworldly, that it truly earns him a place on this list of mythological terrors. The masked fury we refer to is his legendary Rheostrad. This was not a simple fit of rage, it was a supernatural physical and psychological transformation that turned him from a man into a force of nature, a thing of pure destructive chaos. Let's break down the horror of the Rheostrad. The sagas describe it in graphic, visceral detail. When a battle frenzy seized him, his body would contort and twist in a truly grotesque manner. Imagine this: his muscles would expand and swell to an impossible size. His face would warp beyond recognition. One of his eyes would sink deep into his skull, while the other bulged out, hanging on his cheek. His hair, a normal man's crowning glory, would stand on end, stiff and straight as if charged with static electricity, and from the top of his head, a column of dark, steaming blood would erupt, forming a hero's light or a dark halo of gore. His very blood would boil, and the heat radiating from his body was said to be so intense that it could melt snow for 30 feet around him. His jaw would unhinge, and a terrifying roar would tear from his throat, a sound that could shatter the shields of his enemies. He was no longer Cuchulainn, he was a walking, screaming, blood-covered monstrosity. The terror of the Rheostrad was twofold. First, there was the sheer physical horror of it. To face a man and see him become something that defies all natural law, a creature from a nightmare, would be enough to break any soldier. It was a visual assault, a psychological weapon that made enemies flee in pure panic before he even struck a blow. The second layer of terror was the indiscriminate nature of his rage. In the midst of the warp spasm, Cuchulainn couldn't tell friend from foe. He was a whirlwind of death, a force that tore through both enemy ranks and his own. His own people feared the Rheostrad as much as their opponents did. After a battle, he would have to be subdued, often by the women of his tribe, who would expose themselves to him to shame him out of his frenzy, before being plunged into 3 successive vats of cold water to cool his boiling blood. The first vat would explode with heat, the second would boil, and the third would finally become lukewarm. This was the only way to return him to his human form. His place at number 6 is deserved because his terror is a step beyond the berserkers. While the berserker chose to become a beast, Cuchulain's transformation was a magical curse, an uncontrollable and horrifying aspect of his very being. His story is a chilling reminder that even the most celebrated heroes can harbor a darkness so profound that it makes them the very thing they are meant to fight against. The terror of Cuchulain is not just the fear of his strength, but the horrifying visual of a hero becoming a literal monster, a twisted version of himself. It's the fear that the champion you admire could, in an instant, become an inhuman and terrifying force of destruction. But what if the terror isn't in a monstrous physical form or a brutal rage, but in a silent, creeping dread? What about a warrior who is more ghost than man? A shadow whose legend is built on his disappearance and the lingering fear he left behind. We have borne witness to the horrors of bloodlust, the terror of the unfeeling, and the madness of a hero's fury. But what if a warrior's terror came not from a monstrous form or a deafening roar, but from a whisper in the dark? What if the most formidable warrior was one whose face no one had ever seen? At number 5, we journey to the mist-shrouded forests and moonlit battlefields of feudal Japan, where a legend was born not of glory and honor, but of silent dread, the Phantom Samurai. Now, when you hear the word samurai, you probably imagine a warrior in gleaming armor, upholding a code of honor, fighting with courage in open battle. But the legend of the Phantom Samurai shatters that image completely. This warrior was not a symbol of justice. He was a ghost story made flesh. His name, if he even had one, was lost to time. His reputation was whispered in hushed tones around campfires, a chilling tale told to frighten soldiers into submission. He was a force of nature, a silent, creeping dread that paralyzed entire armies. He was the warrior you never saw coming, the one you never saw leaving, and the one whose presence you only knew by the bodies he left behind. The terror of the Phantom Samurai was a psychological one. He didn't fight in open, glorious combat. His battleground was the mind. He mastered the art of stealth and psychological warfare to an almost supernatural degree. His attacks were surgical, swift, and utterly silent. He would strike from the cover of thick fog, from the shadows of dense forests, or from the deafening darkness of a moonless night. His presence was a certainty, but his location was a mystery. Imagine being a soldier on patrol, the night still and heavy around you, and then you hear it, a single faint, high-pitched whistle. You turn, and in a flash, your companion is on the ground, a single precise cut to his throat, with no assailant in sight. That was the Phantom Samurai. He didn't engage in prolonged duels. He was an executioner. His true weapon was not his sword, but the doubt he sowed in the hearts of his enemies. He was a master of his environment. He could move through the trees like a falling leaf, leaving no trace behind. He could disappear into a patch of mist as if he were part of the very air. Entire military camps would fall into a state of panic, paralyzed by the fear that he was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They would see phantom movements in the trees, hear noises that weren't there, and attack their own shadows in a desperate attempt to find an enemy that was, for all intents and purposes, invisible. His signature wasn't a battle banner or a war cry. It was a lingering, paralyzing fear that lingered long after he was gone. The legends tell of a time when a powerful warlord, fed up with the Phantom's attacks, sent his finest samurai to hunt him down. They were disciplined, seasoned warriors, masters of the blade. They followed a trail of whispers and fear into a dense forest, but they never returned. Weeks later, their bodies were found, meticulously arranged in a gruesome tableau, each one killed by a single perfect sword stroke. On a nearby tree, a single piece of paper was pinned with a blade. On it was an image of a single watchful eye, drawn with black ink. It was the only trace he ever left. The Phantom Samurai holds his place at number 5 because he represents a unique kind of terror. We have seen warriors of brutal strength and monstrous rage, but the Phantom's terror comes from his absolute mastery of the unseen. He is a terrifying reminder that not all warriors are meant to be seen. He didn't want to win battles. He wanted to win the war by breaking his enemy's will to fight. He wasn't a man, he was a concept, a specter of death that haunted the dreams of anyone who dared to stand against him. But what about a warrior who used that same psychological terror, not to strike from the shadows, but to unite a nation and face down a mighty empire in open revolt? We've seen terror born of shadow, of madness, and of divine rage. But what happens when that terror is not just an individual's weapon, but but a banner raised by a charismatic leader, forged in the fires of vengeance, and carried by an entire nation's righteous fury. What if the most feared warrior wasn't an unstoppable man, but a queen who became the face of an empire's deepest fears? At number 4, we travel to the rugged, untamed lands of Roman Britain, where a single woman stood against the might of an empire and burned its cities to the ground. This is the legend of Boudica. To understand the sheer terrifying force of Boudica, you must first understand the injustice that fueled her. In the 1st century AD, her husband Prasutagus was the king of the Iceni tribe, a Roman allied kingdom in eastern Britain. When he died, he left his kingdom jointly to his wife and his daughters, hoping to appease the Roman invaders and preserve his people's freedom. But the Romans saw a chance to seize control. They ignored his will, annexed his kingdom, and proceeded to seize property, enslave noblemen, and commit unspeakable atrocities against Boudica and her daughters. The Roman historian Tacitus vividly describes the horrific event. Boudica was publicly flogged, and her daughters were violated. This act of barbaric cruelty was meant to crush the Iceni spirit. Instead, it lit a fire that would burn 3 Roman cities to ashes. Boudica was a leader born of vengeance, and her vengeance was absolute. According to Roman accounts, she was a figure of immense charisma and power. Tacitus describes her as having a flood of fiery red hair that cascaded to her waist, a fierce voice and a piercing stare. She was said to wield a spear and wear a great golden torque around her neck, a symbol of her nobility and a stark warning of the power she now commanded. But her greatest weapon was not her spear, it was her ability to channel the collective fear and rage of her people. She didn't just lead an army, she was a storm of retribution, and her cause was so compelling that she united multiple Celtic tribes, who had long been enemies, creating a massive, terrifying army of more than 100,000 warriors. The terror of Boudica was its scale and its ferocity. The Roman forces, arrogant and overconfident, were completely unprepared for the speed and ruthlessness of her assault. Boudica's army first descended upon Camulodunum, the Roman capital of Britain. They didn't just defeat the Roman garrison, they annihilated the entire city, burning it to the ground and slaughtering every man, woman, and child. Their rage was a hurricane of blood and fire. But that was just the beginning. The Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus was away campaigning, and by the time he received word of the rebellion, Boudica's army was already marching on Londinium, the heart of Roman trade in Britain. Paulinus, knowing he couldn't defend the city, was forced to abandon it. As his army retreated, Boudica's forces moved in, and just as they had done with Camulodunum, they burned Londinium to the ground. A third city, Verulamium, met the same fate. The terror she unleashed was so profound that it sent shockwaves through the Roman Empire. The Roman legions, the most disciplined fighting force in the world, were being systematically destroyed by a barbarian queen. Tacitus estimates that Boudica's rebellion killed as many as 80,000 Roman citizens and their allies. Her name became synonymous with the savage, untamed power of the Celtic lands. To the Romans, she was not just a military threat, she was the embodiment of a primal, unthinking hatred that defied all logic and order. The mere mention of her name could cause panic, and for a time her rebellion threatened to completely push the Roman Empire out of Britain. Her ferocity was not just about winning a war, it was about exacting a price for the humiliation and injustice her people had suffered. Boudica earns her place at number 4 because her terror was a different beast altogether. She was not a solo fighter like the others on this list. She was a leader who became a vessel for her people's terror and turned it outward with cataclysmic effect. She proved that fear is the most powerful weapon of all, and that a single person fueled by vengeance and armed with the loyalty of the downtrodden can bring an empire to its knees. She was a warrior queen who became a legend of terror, not just for her own fighting prowess, but for the tidal wave of destruction she commanded. But what about a warrior whose indomitable fury was so potent, so deeply personal, that it could turn the tide of a great war and become the stuff of legend? We have seen terror that burned cities to the ground and terror that struck from the shadows. But what happens when the greatest terror is a single, solitary man, a warrior whose rage is so profound, so deeply personal, that it becomes a force of nature, a storm that can turn the tide of a great war and leave a trail of broken kings and shattered myths in its wake? At number 3, we return to the cradle of Western civilization and the shores of ancient Troy, where the greatest hero of all time was also the most terrifying. This is the story of Achilles and the indomitable fury that defined his legend. Achilles is often remembered as the demigod hero, the champion of the Greeks, a figure of peerless skill and unmatched valor. But to truly understand his terror, we must look beyond the hero and into the core of the myth itself. The very first word of Homer's Iliad is menein, rage. It is not just anger, it is a divine, overwhelming fury, a consuming fire, that is both Achilles' greatest strength and his most horrifying flaw. This rage was what made him the greatest warrior, but it was also what made him a monster. It was a power he could not control, and it was a force that indiscriminately brought death to friend and foe alike. The terror of Achilles' rage was a slow-building storm. His initial fury was directed at his own commander, King Agamemnon, who in a moment of arrogance took Achilles' prize of war, a woman named Briseis. This personal slight was enough to make Achilles withdraw from the war entirely. A single man's anger was so powerful that it weakened the entire Greek army, a testament to his indomitable skill. His absence turned the tide of the war, and his fellow Greeks began to fall in droves. This period of withdrawal was a chilling demonstration of his power, not just what he could do in battle, but what his absence could do to a battle. He allowed his friends to die, not out of malice, but out of a pride so immense it bordered on the divine. But the true terror of Achilles was unleashed when that rage was turned toward the enemy. The moment that Patroclus, his dearest friend, was killed by the Trojan prince Hector, Achilles' fury broke all bounds. He was no longer a man fighting for glory. He became a living engine of vengeance, a force of pure destructive hatred. He returned to the battlefield, clad in new divine armor forged by the god Hephaestus, and the sight of him alone was enough to send the Trojan army into a panicked retreat. The poet describes him as a hurricane of death, a whirlwind of destruction that cut through the Trojan ranks with horrifying speed and a complete lack of mercy. He wasn't just a warrior, he was an executioner. He hunted Hector, the greatest Trojan champion, and when he found him, he showed no mercy. After killing him, Achilles defiled the body in a way that shocked even his bloodthirsty contemporaries. He pierced the tendons of Hector's ankles, lashed him to his chariot, and then dragged his corpse around the walls of Troy for days. This was not the act of a hero. This was the act of a man so consumed by rage that he was willing to desecrate a body and deny his enemy a proper burial, a heinous crime in their culture. His terror wasn't just in the act of killing. It was in his ability to push past all human decency, all codes of honor, and all moral boundaries in the name of his own vengeance. The scale of his fury was so immense that it even challenged the gods. During his rampage, he filled the river Scamander with so many Trojan bodies that the river god, enraged, rose up and tried to drown him. Achilles, in a fit of divine madness, fought the river itself, a testament to a rage so indomitable it was willing to fight the very forces of nature. His story is the ultimate cautionary tale about what happens when the greatest warrior's greatest strength is a destructive anger that he cannot and will not control. His rage killed friends, shamed kings, and nearly toppled a civilization. He is a terrifying reminder that even in the most celebrated heroes, a darkness can reside that is more powerful and more destructive than any monster. But what about a hero whose divine power and indomitable rage were not just a part of his legend, but the source of a madness so profound that it led him to hunt his own family? We have stood on the battlefield with Achilles, where rage was a weapon of divine consequence. But what if that fury wasn't a choice? What if the greatest hero of all time was not only a blessing to the world, but also a ticking time bomb, cursed by a vengeful goddess to turn his strength against the people he loved most? At number 2, we encounter a hero so iconic, so synonymous with strength and valor, that his darker story is often overlooked. But it is in that darkness where we find a terror so profound, so utterly personal, that it shakes the very foundations of what a hero is. This is the tragic and horrifying legend of Heracles, and the madness that led him to hunt his own kin. To the world, Heracles was the son of Zeus, the half-god who performed impossible feats. He was the epitome of the strongman hero, the conqueror of monsters, the one who completed the 12 labors. But his life was a constant struggle against the jealous rage of the goddess Hera, Zeus's wife, who saw Heracles as a living monument to her husband's infidelity. She tormented him from the moment he was born, sending serpents to kill him in his crib. But her most horrific act of cruelty was reserved for a time when Heracles was a man, a husband, and a father. Hera, seeking to destroy him, inflicted upon him a supernatural, all-consuming madness. This was not a temporary fit of rage like Kun Harshalin's. This was a complete and total perversion of his mind, a demonic possession that twisted his reality. Under the weight of her curse, Heracles believed his own children were the monstrous enemies he had spent his life slaying. He believed his wife, Megara, was an enemy trying to harm them. He saw them not as his family, but as beasts, as targets, as threats to be eliminated with the same monstrous power he had used to kill the Nemean lion or the Lernaean hydra. The terror of this act is not that of a warrior on the battlefield. This is a domestic horror, a terror that comes into your home and turns the one person who is meant to protect you into the very monster you fear. The legend describes Heracles, in his madness, stalking his own family. He murdered his children, one by one, with the same casual, devastating strength he used against his foes. The man who had used his immense power to save civilizations was now using it to commit the most unforgivable crime imaginable. The strength that was meant to be a blessing became a weapon of pure, unadulterated evil. His home, a sanctuary, was transformed into a slaughterhouse, and the hero, the champion of humanity, was turned into a butcher of his own blood. The tragedy of Heracles is that his terror was not a choice. He was an unwilling villain, an instrument of a goddess's cruelty. The horror of the story is amplified 1,000 times over when the madness finally lifts. Heracles, waking up from his blood-soaked frenzy, is left to behold the carnage he has wrought. He has to face the reality of what his own hands have done. His divine strength, his greatest gift, had been used to destroy everything he held dear. The guilt and shame were so profound that he was on the verge of taking his own life. The terror he inflicted upon others was now a terror that consumed his own soul. It was this act, this ultimate horror, that led him to seek atonement through his 12 labors, an attempt to find some meaning, some shred of honor, in a life that had been so irrevocably tainted. Heracles earns his place at number 2 because his terror is the most tragic and personal of all. It's the terrifying realization that even the strongest among us are not immune to the darkness. His story is a chilling reminder that the line between hero and monster can be razor thin, and that a single act of divine cruelty can transform the most celebrated champion into a figure of horrifying destruction. He is the dark hero whose most monstrous act was not an epic battle, but a domestic massacre, a family torn apart by a madness he could not control. But what warrior could possibly be more terrifying than this? Who could outrank a god of war, a ghost, and the greatest hero of all time? Our number 1 isn't a god, or a hero, or a man. He is something else entirely, a figure so powerful, so chaotic, that he threatened the cosmic order itself. We have stood in awe of the gods of war. We have cowered before the unfeeling automaton and the monstrous hero. We have witnessed the destructive power of divine rage and the terror of a queen's vengeance. But for our number 1 spot, we need a warrior who transcends all of these categories. A being who is not a man, not a hero, and not even a god in the traditional sense. A figure of such immense, chaotic, and terrifying power that he single-handedly waged war on the entire celestial bureaucracy and nearly won. This is not a story of a champion who saved the world. This is the story of a cosmic rebel who nearly destroyed it. He is a king born not of flesh and blood, but from a primordial stone. His name is Sun Wukong, and he is the immortal king who destroyed heaven with a scream. Now, many of you know the Monkey King as the charming, mischievous hero of the epic novel Journey to the West. You know him for his cleverness, his loyalty, and his willingness to protect his monk master. But that is the tamed, humbled version of the legend. To truly understand why he is the most terrifying warrior in all of mythology, we must look at who he was before that journey, a wild, immortal demon king of unimaginable power and even more unimaginable arrogance. Sun Wukong's origin story is a tale of unstoppable power. He was born from a magical stone that had been absorbing the essence of heaven and earth for eons. He quickly became the king of a vast troop of monkeys and set out to find a way to escape death, eventually learning the secrets of immortality from a powerful Taoist master. He mastered the 72 earthly transformations, which allowed him to change his form into anything from a fly to a mountain. He learned the cloud somersault, a magical leap that could carry him over 100,000 miles in a single bound. He then acquired his ultimate weapon, the Rui Jingu Bang, a staff he pulled from the bottom of the sea, which could change size at his command and weighed over 13,500 pounds, a weight that no other being on Earth could even lift. With these powers, the Monkey King became a force of pure, destructive chaos. He wasn't evil, but he was amoral, a cosmic troublemaker who answered to no one. He literally erased his name from the book of life and death, rendering himself truly immortal and outside the cycle of rebirth. This defiance was just the beginning. The gods of heaven, concerned about his growing power, offered him a seemingly prestigious position as protector of the horses. Insulted by the low rank, he rebelled, declaring himself the great sage, equal to heaven. This was not a challenge, it was a declaration of war. The terror of Sun Wukong was its sheer existential scale. He didn't just fight, he systematically dismantled the entire celestial order. Heaven sent its greatest warriors against him, the celestial generals, the gods of the seasons, the most powerful of the heavenly kings. Sun Wukong defeated every single one of them. He was faster, stronger, and more clever than all of them combined. He was a force of pure, untamable chaos, an eternal being with no sense of consequence, and his legend became a testament to what happens when absolute power meets absolute mischief. The peak of his terror was his war on heaven. He stormed the palace of the Jade Emperor, smashing celestial gates, tearing down temples, and fighting a one-man war against a pantheon of gods. His war cry, his scream of defiance, was said to have shaken the very foundations of the cosmos. The gods, terrified and desperate, had no weapon that could stop him. He could not be killed, he was immortal. He could not be trapped, he could transform into anything and escape. He was a living paradox, a flaw in the very design of the universe, and he was tearing it apart with a smile on his face. He was eventually subdued not by a warrior, but by the Buddha himself, who tricked him and imprisoned him under a mountain. But even in his imprisonment, his power was a source of fear. So why is he number one? Because every other warrior on our list, from the god Ares to the hero Heracles, operated within the boundaries of a system, a set of cosmic rules. They were powerful, terrifying, but they could be reasoned with, defeated, or eventually tamed. Sun Wukong was different. He didn't just defy the rules, he destroyed them. His terror was the fear of a complete cosmic collapse, the idea that a single chaotic force could topple the entire order of the universe just because he was bored. He is the ultimate example of a warrior whose success and power were so great that he transcended the very concepts of heroism and villainy, becoming a legend of pure, indomitable, terrifying might. He is the one warrior whose power was so absolute, it was not only feared by mortals, but by the gods themselves. You have now journeyed through the stories of 10 terrifying warriors, from the god of brutal slaughter to the immortal king who nearly toppled the heavens. So I have to ask you one last time, knowing what you know now, would you truly survive facing our number one,